London, 1544. A servant unwraps the king's bandages and freezes. Something is moving inside the rotting flesh. Pale forms writhing through muscle and bone. The physicians can't explain it. The court buries the reports. But what the embalmers discovered 3 years later when they opened Henry's coffin would explain everything, and it's far worse than anyone imagined. Picture a spring morning in 1544, inside Hampton Court Palace. A young servant named Thomas Wyatt enters the king's private chamber, carrying fresh linen and rosewater. The smell hits him first, a putrid wave of decay so thick he nearly vomits on the marble floor. He's been warned, they all have, but nothing prepares you for the reality of tending to Henry VIII's rotting leg. As he approaches the royal bed, the king groans in his sleep, and Thomas begins the delicate process of unwrapping the soiled bandages that cover the ulcer. Layer after layer of stained cloth comes away, each one worse than the last, until finally he reaches the wound itself. That's when he sees it. Movement. Not the pulse of blood or the twitch of muscle, but something else entirely. Pale, segmented forms, dozens of them, writhing through the exposed flesh like fingers searching for something deeper. Thomas drops the bandages and stumbles backward, his scream caught in his throat. The king's chief physician, Dr. William Butts, rushes in and clamps a hand over the servant's mouth. "You saw nothing," he hisses, his eyes wild with fear. Do you understand? Nothing. But Thomas had seen everything, and what lived inside England's most powerful monarch would haunt him until his dying day. The discovery sent shockwaves through the inner circle of the royal household. Dr. Butts immediately convened a secret meeting with the king's most trusted physicians in a locked chamber far from prying ears. They examined their notes, compared observations, and arrived at a conclusion that terrified them all. The creatures had been there for weeks, possibly months, feeding on the necrotic tissue that lined the wound like a cathedral. Some argued they were common maggots, the kind that spontaneously generate in rotting meat, as medical wisdom of the time suggested. But others weren't convinced. The movement was wrong, too deliberate, too organized. These things burrowed deep, creating tunnels through muscle and sinew, channels that wept a yellowish discharge that no amount of honey or wine could staunch. One physician, a Spaniard named Dr. Rodrigo, suggested they might be parasitic worms, perhaps contracted during one of Henry's many campaigns in France, where soldiers often returned with strange afflictions. The debate grew heated until Dr. Butts slammed his fist on the table and declared that the nature of the infestation mattered less than keeping it secret. If word got out that the King of England was being consumed from the inside, it would be seen as divine judgment, proof that God had turned against the monarch who broke with Rome. Foreign powers would sense weakness. Rebellions would ignite across the kingdom. The very stability of England hung on their ability to hide what was eating their king alive. In the weeks that followed, a conspiracy of silence descended over Hampton Court like a funeral shroud. Servants who had witnessed anything unusual were transferred to distant estates, or in some cases, simply disappeared. The king's chambers were declared off-limits except to a select few, and even they were sworn to secrecy under pain of death. New treatments were attempted, each more desperate than the last. They packed the wound with crushed pearls, believing the gemstones possessed purifying properties. They applied poultices made from boiled toad skins and mercury, remedies that only added to Henry's agony. At night, his screams echoed through the palace corridors, and courtiers whispered that the king was being punished for his many wives, his break from the Catholic Church, the monasteries he'd destroyed. But the truth was both simpler and more horrifying than any divine retribution. Something had found a home inside Henry's flesh, and it was multiplying. The question that kept Dr. Butts awake at night wasn't whether the king would recover. It was how long they could keep hiding what was happening before the entire kingdom discovered that their monarch was already half dead, his body a feast for creatures that should not exist. But to understand how England's greatest king became a host for parasites, we need to go back 8 years, to the moment everything changed. January 24th, 1536. The air at Greenwich Palace crackles with excitement as nobles gather for the annual jousting tournament, Henry's favorite spectacle. At 44 years old and well over 300 pounds, the king insists on participating despite his physician's protests. He's older now, slower, but he refuses to accept that his days of martial glory are behind him. The crowd roars as Henry mounts his massive warhorse, a beast bred specifically to carry his considerable weight in full-plate armor. His opponent, a young nobleman named Henry Norris, waits at the opposite end of the tilt yard, lance raised, clearly nervous about facing his monarch. The trumpets sound and both riders kick their horses into a thundering charge. What happens next takes less than 5 seconds but will echo through the remaining decade of Henry's life. Norris's lance strikes Henry's breastplate at an awkward angle, the impact throwing the king backward in his saddle. He loses his grip, his balance shifts, and suddenly 400 pounds of king and armor are toppling sideways. The horse, confused and frightened, stumbles and falls directly onto Henry's left leg, pinning him to the frozen ground. For 2 hours, they say, the king lay there, crushed beneath the animal's weight, before enough men could gather to lift the creature off him. When they finally freed him, Henry's leg bore a deep gash just above the knee, a wound that seemed manageable at first, nothing more than a flesh wound that a vigorous man like Henry could easily survive. But there were whispers, even then, that something about the accident felt wrong. Several witnesses reported that the girth strap on Henry's saddle, the thick leather band that secured it to the horse, looked frayed, almost cut. A groom who had prepared the king's tack that morning was found dead in the stables 3 days later, officially from a fall, though his neck showed bruises consistent with strangulation. Had someone tampered with the king's equipment, hoping for exactly this kind of catastrophic failure? The court was a nest of vipers in 1536. Henry was desperate for a male heir, and his current wife, Anne Boleyn, had just suffered another miscarriage. Factions were forming, enemies circling, and the king's vulnerability made him a target. The jousting accident could have been exactly what it appeared, a tragic mishap, or it could have been something far more sinister, an assassination attempt that failed to kill but succeeded in creating a wound that would slowly destroy the king from within. The royal physicians treated the injury with standard methods of the time. They cauterized it with hot irons, believing that burning would prevent corruption. They packed it with cloth soaked in wine and honey, substances thought to have healing properties. They prayed over it, invoking saints and angels. For a few weeks it seemed to work. The wound began to close, and Henry resumed his royal duties, even riding again despite the pain. But beneath the surface, something was already going terribly wrong. By spring of 1536, the wound had reopened, and this time it refused to heal. The flesh around it turned angry and red, then black at the edges, a sure sign of mortification. Pus leaked constantly, soaking through bandages and staining Henry's elaborate clothing. The smell became so unbearable that servants burned perfumed candles day and night, trying to mask the stench of rotting tissue. Henry's mood darkened alongside his wound. The jovial, charismatic king who had once dazzled Europe with his charm transformed into a paranoid tyrant. He executed Anne Boleyn in May of that year, just 4 months after the accident, accusing her of adultery and treason on evidence so flimsy that even his own advisors questioned it. Some historians would later argue that Henry's personality changes began with this wound, that the constant pain and the infections spreading through his body poisoned his mind as surely as it corrupted his flesh. The physicians tried everything. They bled him regularly, believing that removing bad blood would restore balance to his humors. They made him drink concoctions of crushed herbs and animal parts, remedies passed down through generations of healers. Nothing worked. The wound would seem to improve for a few days, closing slightly, the discharge lessening, and then suddenly it would erupt again, worse than before, as if something inside was fighting against every attempt to heal it. And perhaps something was. But the worst was yet to come. By 1540, 4 years after the initial injury, Henry's leg had become a nightmare of suppurating flesh and exposed bone. The wound had expanded from a simple cut to an ulcer the size of a man's fist, a crater that went so deep physicians could see the white gleam of femur at the bottom. The king could no longer walk without assistance, his enormous weight supported by servants who practically carried him from room to room. But it was the discharge that truly horrified those who attended him. The liquid that wept from the wound wasn't simply pus anymore. It had changed, becoming thick and yellowish with a strange viscosity, and within it physicians began to notice small dark specks that moved. At first they convinced themselves these were merely particles of dead tissue, debris from the body's attempt to heal itself. But as weeks turned to months, the truth became impossible to ignore. There was something living in the king's leg, something that had made a home in the rotting flesh and was multiplying. The smell intensified beyond anything natural. It wasn't just the odor of infection or decay, though those were certainly present. There was something else, a sickly sweet undertone that made people's stomachs turn and their eyes water. Servants began drawing lots to determine who would have to change the king's bandages, and the losers often emerged from his chambers pale and shaking, some vomiting in the corridors. One lady-in-waiting fainted at the sight of the wound and was immediately dismissed from court, her silence bought with gold and threats. The theories began circulating among the medical community, whispered in Latin behind closed doors where the king couldn't hear. Some physicians believed it was a form of the French disease, what we now know as syphilis, which Henry had almost certainly contracted in his youth from one of his many mistresses. Syphilis could cause terrible ulcers in its late stages, eating away at flesh and bone, driving men mad with pain and paranoia. Others suggested it might be scrofula, the king's evil, ironically enough, a tuberculosis infection of the lymph nodes that could create draining wounds. But there were also darker theories, ones that physicians only dare to mention in the deepest night. Some claimed the wound had been cursed, that Anne Boleyn's ghost had laid a hex upon the king who murdered her, condemning him to rot alive as punishment for his sins. Others spoke of poison, a slow-acting toxin introduced into the wound during one of the early treatments designed to keep it festering forever. And then there were those who had seen the movement, who had caught glimpses of pale forms writhing in the depths of the ulcer, and they wondered if perhaps something had been deliberately placed there, some creature or parasite introduced by an enemy who wanted the king to suffer a fate worse than death. The paranoia spread like the infection itself, and soon Henry trusted no one, not even his physicians. He had food tasters check his medicines, guards watch over his chambers at night, and priests bless every bandage before it touched his skin. But nothing could stop what was happening inside him. By 1543, the wound had begun to spread. Small secondary ulcers appeared on Henry's right leg, then on his arms, each one following the same horrifying pattern. A red spot that quickly broke open, exposing flesh that refused to heal and seemed to harbor the same moving darkness. The physicians were baffled and terrified. Whatever afflicted the king was clearly systemic, traveling through his body in ways they couldn't understand or prevent. They debated whether to amputate the original leg, a radical procedure that would likely kill a man of Henry's size and age but might stop the spread. Henry refused, declaring that he would rather die than rule as a cripple, and that was the end of that discussion. The treatments became increasingly desperate and bizarre. They applied live leeches directly to the wounds, hoping the creatures would suck out the corruption. But the leeches died within minutes, their bodies shriveling as if poisoned. They tried burning the flesh with acids, cauterizing deeper and deeper, but the wounds always returned. A visiting physician from Italy suggested a radical treatment. He would cut into the wound and physically remove whatever was causing the infection. It was a dangerous proposal, essentially an exploratory surgery at a time when anesthesia didn't exist, and infection killed most surgical patients. But Henry, driven to madness by pain and desperation, agreed. What they discovered during that procedure would change everything and lead to one of the greatest medical cover-ups in history. But the truth, as always, has a way of surfacing, even centuries later. The procedure took place on a cold November morning in 1543, in a private chamber converted into a makeshift surgery. Dr. Alessandro Benedetti, the Italian physician, had performed similar operations on wounded soldiers in the Italian wars, and he approached Henry's ulcer with the clinical detachment of a man who had seen the worst the human body could offer. He made his first incision along the edge of the wound, cutting away the blackened flesh to expose the healthy tissue beneath, or what should have been healthy tissue. What he found instead made him freeze, his scalpel trembling in his hand. The wound wasn't simply a surface injury that had gone deep, it was a network. A honeycomb of channels and tunnels that extended through the muscle in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. And within these channels, clearly visible now that he had opened them to the light, were pale, segmented forms, hundreds of them, moving with an intelligence that no maggot possessed. They weren't feeding randomly on dead tissue, they were burrowing, creating pathways through the king's leg like miners excavating tunnels. Dr. Benedetti called for his assistants to hold the wound open wider, ignoring Henry's screams of agony, and examined the creatures more closely. They were approximately 2 inches long, translucent white with darker segments visible through their skin, and they had small hooked mouths that they used to anchor themselves in the flesh. When he tried to remove one with forceps, it contracted violently, burrowing deeper as if it knew it was being threatened. The other physicians crowded around, their horror mixed with a terrible fascination. Doctor Butts argued that they should remove every creature they could find and burn them, cleanse the wound completely, but Dr. Benedetti shook his head, explaining that there were too many, and that attempting to extract them all would require destroying so much tissue that Henry would certainly die from the trauma. There was also another problem, one that the Italian physician hesitated to voice but finally admitted. He didn't know what these things were. They weren't maggots, he was certain of that. Maggots were the larvae of flies, which appeared in rotting flesh, but were actually beneficial, eating only dead tissue and often helping wounds to heal. These creatures were something else entirely, parasitic worms of a type he had never encountered in his decades of medical practice. They seemed to be feeding not just on dead flesh but on living tissue as well, slowly consuming the king from within while simultaneously keeping him alive, as if they had some interest in prolonging their host's suffering. The observation sent chills through everyone present. Could these things be intelligent? Could they have been deliberately introduced? Dr. Benedetti sutured the wound closed, leaving the creatures inside because what else could he do? He prescribed new treatments, stronger poultices, prayers to different saints, but privately he told Dr. Butts that the king was beyond saving. The infestation was too advanced, too deeply entrenched. All they could do now was manage the pain and hope that Henry died quickly, before the creatures consumed enough of him to make his condition undeniable to the entire kingdom. 3 days after the surgery, Dr. Benedetti was found dead in his chambers, officially from a sudden fever, though no one else in the palace had fallen ill. His surgical notes and drawings of what he had found inside the king's leg vanished, removed from his rooms by persons unknown. The other physicians received a visit from the king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, who made it abundantly clear that everything they had witnessed was now a state secret protected by treason laws. Anyone who spoke of it would be executed, their families stripped of titles and property, their names erased from history. The message was received. The conspiracy of silence deepened, became absolute. But secrets have a way of leaking, especially in a place like the Tudor court, where everyone was spying on everyone else for advantage and profit. Servants whispered to merchants who whispered to foreign ambassadors who sent coded letters back to their governments. By 1544, rumors about the king's condition were circulating throughout Europe, though no one knew the full truth. The Spanish ambassador reported that Henry was rotting alive and consumed by devils. The French court spread rumors that the English king had contracted leprosy and was being kept isolated to prevent panic. Closer to home, in the taverns and markets of London, people spoke in hushed tones about divine punishment, about a king who had defied God and was now paying the price in a currency of flesh and agony. And perhaps they were right. But the question remained, were the creatures that lived inside Henry VIII natural or supernatural? Parasites or demons? The answer would determine not just medical history, but the fate of England itself. Anne Boleyn died screaming Henry's name, her head separated from her body by a French swordsman's blade on May 19, 1536, just 4 months after the king's jousting accident. On the scaffold, witnesses reported that she wore a calm expression, forgiving her executioner and praying for the king's soul. But others claimed that in her final moments, her composure cracked, and she spoke a curse. "May the king suffer as I have suffered. May his body betray him as he has betrayed me. May he know pain that has no end and find no rest in death." The official records deny this, calling it Protestant propaganda, but the timing is impossible to ignore. Henry's wound refused to heal from the moment Anne died, as if something in her final words had taken root in his flesh. By 1541, this theory had gained such traction at court that Henry ordered Anne's remains exhumed from their crude grave in the Tower of London Chapel to ensure she hadn't been buried with occult symbols or cursed objects. They found nothing, of course, just bones in a simple coffin. But the belief persisted. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, became the next target of suspicion. Young, beautiful, and unfaithful, she was accused not just of adultery but of something far darker, poisoning the king's wound to hasten his death. The theory went that she was applying something to his bandages, some substance that kept the ulcer festering and perhaps even introduced the parasitic creatures that now inhabited it. Under torture, one of her alleged lovers confessed that Catherine had given him a small vial of dark liquid and instructed him to add it to the king's medicine. Whether this confession was true or extracted through agony is impossible to know, but it was enough. Catherine was executed in February 1542, beheaded like Anne before her, and her dying screams echoed through the tower. But the execution solved nothing. The wound continued to deteriorate, the creatures continued to multiply, and Henry's paranoia reached new heights. He became convinced that foreign powers had sent assassins armed not with daggers but with parasites, tiny biological weapons designed to destroy him slowly while making it look like a natural illness. He ordered the arrest of several foreign physicians at court, particularly those from France and Spain, countries that had reason to hate him. Under interrogation, one of them, a French doctor named Rémy Gaudin, made a startling claim. He said that during the Italian wars he had encountered soldiers who suffered from similar infestations, wounds that hosted strange worms that burrowed through flesh and could not be removed. He called them vers du diable, devil worms, and said that some military surgeons had learned to weaponize them, introducing them into enemy wounds to ensure slow and agonizing deaths. Could someone have done this to Henry? It seemed impossible the wound had occurred during a jousting accident. How could anyone have predicted that and prepared to infect it? Unless, of course, the accident itself had been arranged. Dr. Godin died in the tower before he could elaborate on his claims, officially from self-inflicted wounds, though the guards reported hearing screams that suggested otherwise. His testimony, such as it was, added fuel to the conspiracy theories, but provided no real answers. Meanwhile, the Catholic faction at court whispered that Henry's condition was divine retribution for his break with Rome. When he declared himself supreme head of the Church of England in 1534, he'd committed the ultimate blasphemy, placing himself above God's appointed representative on earth. The Pope had excommunicated him, and perhaps God had sent these creatures as a plague, a punishment that would not kill quickly but would slowly devour the heretic king until he repented or died screaming. In 1543, a Jesuit priest managed to infiltrate the palace disguised as a physician's assistant, his mission to observe the king's condition and report back to Rome. What he witnessed terrified him. In a letter smuggled out of England, he described Henry's wound as a mouth of hell that speaks in the language of writhing corruption. He claimed to have seen the creatures himself during a bandage change and wrote that they were no natural thing but servants of the adversary, sent to claim a soul that has long been promised to darkness. The letter caused a sensation in Catholic Europe, with some clergy declaring it proof of God's judgment, while others dismissed it as propaganda. But the priest's description matched too closely with what the physicians had seen to be pure invention. He also mentioned something else, something that would haunt investigators for centuries. He claimed that during certain phases of the moon, particularly when it was full, the creatures became more active. The wound would open wider, bleeding more profusely, and Henry would suffer seizures where he claimed to hear voices speaking in languages he didn't understand. This detail, so specific and bizarre, suggested either that the priest had genuine inside knowledge or that something truly supernatural was occurring within the king's body. The priest was eventually caught and executed, his death officially attributed to espionage. But his letter survived, copied and distributed throughout Catholic Europe, becoming part of the legend of Henry VIII's cursed wound. Whether you believed in divine punishment, poison, assassination, or simple medical misfortune, one thing was certain. Something was consuming the King of England, and no power on earth seemed able to stop it. The only question was how long Henry could survive with hell literally eating him from the inside out. By 1545, Henry VIII was barely recognizable as the athletic prince, who had once impressed all of Europe with his jousting prowess and musical talent. He now weighed well over 400 pounds, his body swollen with fluid and fat, his face bloated almost beyond recognition. But it was his mind that had changed most drastically. The king who had once composed music and debated theology with the greatest scholars of his age now spent hours staring at walls, muttering to himself, occasionally bursting into tears or rage without apparent cause. His personal attendants reported incidents that suggested his grip on reality was loosening. He would wake in the middle of the night screaming about insects under his skin, clawing at his arms and legs until they bled, insisting that the worms from his leg wound had somehow traveled throughout his body and were now burrowing through his organs. Physicians tried to assure him this was impossible, but secretly they weren't certain. The secondary ulcers that had appeared on his other leg and arms suggested that whatever afflicted him was indeed systemic, spreading through his bloodstream or lymphatic system in ways medieval medicine couldn't comprehend. One night, guards heard the king bellowing in his chambers, and when they rushed in, they found him trying to cut into his own arm with an eating knife, convinced he could feel something moving beneath the skin. Doctor. Butts managed to calm him with opium tinctures, but the incident revealed how close Henry was to complete mental collapse. The pain alone would have driven most men insane, a constant throbbing agony that no medicine could fully dull. But there seemed to be something else happening, some neurological effect from the infestation. Modern medical researchers studying historical accounts of Henry's symptoms have suggested that certain parasitic infections can release neurotoxins, chemicals that affect the brain, and cause psychiatric symptoms. If the creatures in Henry's leg were indeed parasitic worms of some exotic species, they might have been producing substances that entered his bloodstream and crossed the blood-brain barrier, slowly poisoning his mind as they consumed his flesh. This would explain the dramatic personality changes, the paranoia, the hallucinations, and the violent mood swings that characterized his final years. But in 1545, no one understood neurotoxins or blood-brain barriers. They saw a king going mad and assumed it was either divine punishment or demonic possession, neither of which had a medical solution. Henry's weight gain complicated everything. At over 400 pounds, he couldn't walk without assistance, couldn't mount a horse, couldn't even stand for more than a few minutes without his legs, particularly the diseased one, collapsing beneath him. Special furniture had to be constructed to support his bulk. His clothing was essentially tents of fabric, designed to hide his grotesque proportions from public view. The wound itself had become nearly impossible to treat, because simply accessing it required multiple servants to lift and position the king's massive leg. The smell had grown so overwhelming that physicians wore pomanders filled with strong spices pressed against their noses during examinations, and even then, many vomited. The ulcer was now described as bottomless, a pit of corruption that seemed to go down to the bone and beyond, as if the creatures inside were hollowing him out, creating a cavern where there should have been solid flesh. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, bore the worst of it. She had married the king in July 1543, knowing full well what she was getting into, a calculated decision to gain power and position. But nothing could have prepared her for the reality of nursing a rotting, paranoid, obese monster who was being eaten alive by parasites. Her private letters, those that survived and weren't destroyed by later Tudor authorities, paint a picture of absolute horror. She described nights when Henry would wake screaming, convinced that the worms were crawling up his throat, choking him. She wrote of having to help change his bandages, a process that took hours and required iron will to complete, without fainting from the smell and the sight of those pale forms writhing in the depths of his flesh. She mentioned that sometimes during the night she could hear sounds coming from the wound, soft rustling noises like paper being crumpled, and once she swore she heard something that sounded like whispers, though she knew that was impossible and attributed it to exhaustion and stress. Catherine also documented Henry's decline with clinical detail, noting the progression of symptoms, the tremors in his hands, the slurring of his speech, the episodes where he forgot where he was or who she was, calling her by the names of dead wives. She wrote that by 1546, the king had more bad days than good, more moments of confusion than clarity. She wondered in her diary whether it was mercy or cruelty that kept him alive, whether God was punishing him or testing her, and whether the creatures in his leg were the cause of his madness or merely a symptom of a deeper corruption, something wrong with Henry at a fundamental level that had finally manifested physically. The answer, she feared, was something she would never know, and something that should perhaps remain hidden, because some truths are too terrible to face. The year 1546 marked the beginning of the end. By October, Henry VIII could no longer leave his bed except when lifted by teams of servants into a specially designed chair that allowed him to be wheeled from room to room. The wound on his left leg had opened to such a size that you could supposedly fit a man's fist inside it, and the creatures within had multiplied beyond counting. Physicians who examined him reported that the entire lower third of his leg was now essentially hollow, a shell of skin containing nothing but corruption and parasites. The secondary ulcers on his right leg and arms had also worsened, each following the same pattern: initial inflammation, then breaking open, then the appearance of those telltale pale forms, burrowing and feeding. One physician, in a report that was immediately classified, estimated that there were now thousands of the creatures living inside the king's body, all feeding on him simultaneously, keeping him in a state of perpetual agony that opium could barely touch. Henry's mind flickered in and out like a dying candle. He would have moments of surprising clarity where he would discuss state matters and give coherent orders, only to suddenly veer off into incomprehensible ramblings about devils and angels fighting over his soul. He spoke frequently of his dead wives, particularly Anne Boleyn, claiming he could see her standing at the foot of his bed, watching him suffer with a small smile. He begged her forgiveness, wept like a child, then just as suddenly became enraged, screaming that she was a witch who had cursed him and demanding she be executed again, having forgotten she was long dead. During his last months, something even stranger began to occur. Witnesses reported that the wound seemed to pulse independently of Henry's heartbeat, as if something inside had developed its own rhythm. The discharge increased in volume, soaking through multiple layers of bandages and filling the air with that sickly sweet stench that had become the king's constant companion. But most disturbing were the sounds. Multiple attendants reported hearing noises emanating from the wound itself, described as scratching, rustling, or in some accounts, a sound almost like whispers or wet breathing. One servant girl claimed she saw the skin around the ulcer moving in waves, as if something beneath was trying to push its way out. She was dismissed from service immediately, but her account found its way into several private journals kept by courtiers. Physicians debated whether these phenomena were real or mass hysteria brought on by months of stress and horror. But those who examined the wound closely admitted, in private, that they too had witnessed things that defied rational explanation. The creatures seemed to be organizing themselves, creating structures within the cavity of Henry's leg, almost like a nest. Some physicians speculated that they were preparing to pupate, to transform into whatever adult form they possessed, and that Henry had become not just a host but a breeding ground. The thought was too horrible to pursue, but it raised an urgent question. What would happen when these things matured? Would they emerge from the king's body? Would they spread to others? The physicians prayed that Henry would die before they found out, because if these creatures could reproduce and infest other people, then the king's suffering might just be the beginning of a plague that could devastate all of England. In his final weeks, Henry requested that all the mirrors in his chambers be removed. He could no longer bear to see what he had become, a mountain of diseased flesh, a once magnificent king reduced to a writhing, weeping creature that smelled of the grave. Catherine Parr stayed by his side despite having every reason to flee, and she recorded his final coherent statement in late December 1546. "They have built a kingdom inside me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I feel them crawling through my dreams. When I close my eyes, I see through theirs, all those tiny eyes, looking out from inside my own flesh. Am I still the king? Or am I just the castle they've conquered?" The physicians had no answer. They increased his opium dosage to levels that should have killed him, but somehow Henry's massive constitution kept him alive, trapped in a haze of pain and hallucination. As January 1547 arrived, preparations began for what everyone knew was inevitable. The king's coffin was commissioned, though this detail was kept secret from Henry himself. It was made of lead, extraordinarily thick, sealed with metal bands that could be welded shut. Official explanations claimed this was standard practice for royal burials, but those involved in its construction knew better. They had been told that the king's body would need to be contained, sealed away quickly and securely for reasons they were not permitted to question. On the night of January 27th, Henry suffered his final crisis. Seizures racked his enormous body for hours, his wounds erupting with discharge so copious that it soaked through the bedding and pooled on the floor. And then, just before dawn, silence fell. Henry VIII was dead, but the nightmare was only beginning. The embalmers arrived within an hour of Henry's death, working with unprecedented speed to prepare the body before rigor mortis could set in. Royal protocol dictated that the king's body should lie in state for several days, allowing subjects to pay their respects, but the physicians insisted on immediate processing. They gave various excuses: the warm weather, the king's size, the complexity of the procedure, but the real reason was something they couldn't admit. They needed to seal Henry's body away before anyone could examine it too closely, before anyone could see what lived inside him. The lead coffin waited nearby, its lid ready to be soldered shut the moment the corpse was placed inside. But as the embalmers began their work, removing Henry's clothing and preparing to drain his blood and organs, they made a discovery that sent several of them running from the room in horror. The wounds hadn't stopped bleeding. Even hours after death, discharge continued to seep from the ulcers, and within that discharge, still moving, were hundreds of the pale creatures, now seemingly frantic, crawling across Henry's cold skin as if searching for a way to escape their dying host. The chief embalmer, a man named Richard Ferris, who had prepared dozens of noble corpses, later testified in a sealed deposition that he had never seen anything like it. The worms, if that's what they were, seemed to be abandoning the body, emerging from the wounds in waves, dropping onto the floor where they writhed for a few moments before dying. He and his assistants had to sweep them up and burn them in a brazier, a process that filled the chamber with an acrid smoke and a smell that made grown men vomit. But that wasn't the worst of it. When the embalmers opened Henry's torso to remove the organs, as was customary for royal burials, they found that the infestation had spread throughout his body cavity. The abdominal lining was riddled with small holes, tracks left by the creatures as they burrowed through tissue. His intestines showed signs of parasitic damage, sections of the gut wall thin and perforated. His liver was discolored and swollen, possibly from the toxins the creatures produced. Most disturbing of all, when they examined his heart, they found several of the worms had actually made their way into the cardiac muscle, creating small tunnels through the organ itself. It was a medical impossibility, or at least it should have been. How could parasites migrate from a leg wound into the heart? Some of the embalmers suggested they must have traveled through the bloodstream, though that raised questions about how they survived in blood vessels and why they didn't simply cause immediate fatal blockages. Others whispered darker theories that these weren't natural parasites at all, that they had been placed inside Henry through witchcraft or alchemy, and that they possessed abilities no earthly creature should have. Richard Ferrars ordered everyone present to take an oath of silence, threatening them with charges of treason if they ever spoke of what they had seen. He then directed that Henry's organs be burned rather than preserved, the intestines, liver, heart, everything reduced to ash and scattered. The body cavity was packed with spices and resins, then sewn shut. Within 6 hours of death, Henry VIII's corpse was sealed inside the lead coffin, and the lid was welded shut with such thoroughness that it would require industrial tools to ever open again. The official report stated that the embalming had proceeded normally with no unusual findings. The truth would remain locked away for centuries. The secrets of Henry's body did not remain buried as planned. During the funeral procession from Westminster to Windsor Castle, the massive lead coffin, weighing over 800 pounds, was being transported on a special wagon when a wheel collapsed under the strain. The impact caused a seam along the side of the coffin to split, releasing a flood of decomposing liquid and an overpowering stench that caused horses to panic and guards to vomit. Witnesses reported something even more disturbing: pale, worm-like forms moving within the spilled fluid. Soldiers spent hours collecting what had leaked onto the road, later burning it to prevent further contamination. One soldier later wrote that he helped clean the king's corruption from the ground, describing white creatures that still twisted as they died. Though the incident was officially denied and dismissed as propaganda, the number of independent accounts suggests something unusual truly occurred. Henry's body was eventually sealed inside a reinforced vault at Windsor, which remains unopened to this day. Soon after, his son Edward VI ordered most of his father's medical records destroyed, claiming they contained information harmful to the crown. What remains are only fragments, private letters, and scattered references. Modern historians believe Henry suffered from severe infections related to chronic wounds, possibly involving parasitic infestation. While these theories explain much of his suffering, they fail to fully account for the eyewitness reports surrounding the coffin. More extreme explanations, both biological and supernatural, remain unproven but persist in popular lore. All attempts to exhume Henry's remains have been denied. His tomb stays sealed, and with it, the truth of what consumed him in his final years. In the end, Henry's story is a stark reminder that even the most powerful rulers are vulnerable to the frailty of the human body. A king who reshaped England was ultimately defeated not by enemies or war, but by something small, unseen, and relentless, proving that power offers no protection against decay and death. Before we end, if this deep dive into one of history's most disturbing medical mysteries has kept you watching this long, hit that subscribe button. We're bringing you more forgotten horrors and hidden truths that textbooks won't teach you. Drop a comment telling us what historical figure's death you want us to investigate next. Because trust me, Henry VIII isn't the only royal with secrets buried in their tomb. And smash that like button if you want YouTube to show this to more people. Because these stories deserve to be told, no matter how disturbing they are. History isn't just dates and battles. Sometimes it's worms eating a king alive while his empire pretends everything is fine. And that's exactly the kind of truth we're here to uncover.